to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and today I'm actually going to talk about, should you keep your existing tenant or should you be tossing them out, putting a new tenant in, right? So the big question that most people have is that when they have an existing tenant, the reluctancy in commercial, because of the vacancy time that it takes, is that you just want to keep your existing tenant. But sometimes that's like getting blood out of a stone or flogging a dead horse, whatever you want to call it. And it's just not going to happen. That tenant is not going to pay the rent you want. It's not going to take care of your premise, and it's not going to pay rent on time, and maybe not even sign the lease that you want. And I've seen time and time again that owners who are wanting to make something work in the commercial property try time and time again to get their current existing tenant working rather than replace it with a new tenant. Now, should you replace with a new tenant is the question, and how much is that going to cost you? Now, this is a fundamental question, and sometimes if you have a tenant that's underperforming, and if you have a tenant that's not signing a lease, you have a tenant that's not willing to pay market rent, or you have a tenant who's simply always late in rent, always making excuses, don't pay their outgoings. If you have all of these things, then you should definitely get a new tenant. But let's say that you have an existing tenant right now, and your existing tenant is doing well, they're paying their rent, and they're looking at deciding whether they're staying or they shouldn't be staying. And you're thinking, should I offer them the incentives or I shouldn't offer them incentives to get them to stay or not? What is that cost to you? So should you keep your tenant or should you be getting rid of them? So let's check that out. On the board, what is the cost of it? Okay, so firstly, one thing that most people get wrong when they look at a management or leasing proposal is how much it costs to lease out a commercial premise versus management. Now, management is about 4 to 5% plus GST management of the rent. Now, leasing is anywhere from 10 to 15% plus GST of your first year's rent. So if you are renting out a property for $100,000, 11% or 10% is $10,000 plus GST, so $11,000 when you're getting anywhere from a 1 to 2 year lease. Now, if you're getting a 5-year lease, it could be 15%, so it's $15,000 plus GST of the first year's rent. Now, most people think, oh, that's so exorbitant, so much more than what you get in a residential property, right? In residential is 1 week, 1 month, whatever it is, right? But in commercial, it's not. What happens with that in commercial is that your agent only gets one bite of the cherry, and he might only get one bite of the cherry every 3, 5, or even 6 or 10 years. Because remember, when you sign a lease with residential agency, you sign a 6 months, 12 months lease. There's really no options. But in commercial, it's different because your tenant gets to sign a 3-year lease with 3-year options, maybe with 2, 3, or 4 3-year options. So essentially the whole term of the lease could be anywhere from 3 years if they decide not to take up their option, to maybe 15 years if they take up the next 4 3-year options. And many times the tenant are there for at least 2 or 3 terms, which is on average up to about 10 years. Now, if you sign a 5x5, and especially as a national tenant or any tenant that's going to be spending $200,000 or $300,000 on a fit out, they're likely to stay 15, 20 years. So the agent is taking one bite of the cherry, so he's charging an amount that is higher than residential. So it works out to be about 4 to 6 weeks of the rent that you'll be getting in the first year. So on $100,000, the leasing commission is about 10 to 15%, which is quite normal in this current market. So let's work out the numbers on this, right? What does that look like? Let's say that you're getting a property, $100,000 is the rent, right? That's the rent of the property. And so let's say your leasing commission is somewhere around 10%, right? Because we're thinking it might be a 3-year lease, it might be, it might be 12%, might be something like that. So if it's let's just put it on the cheaper end of the scale. So that's 10K, right? Now, when you get a tenant in, it's typically 1 month per year in terms of incentives to get them in, and that can be in fit out, or that can be a combination of rent-free, fit out, plus maybe, absorbing the outgoings, whatever it happens to be, that negotiation you have. But it could be, and I'm doing this on a cheaper end because it could be 15,000, just bear that in mind. But you've got, what do you have on top of that? Marketing, right? Marketing could be, let's say, 3K. right? For a property that may be at 100 grand, the property is probably $1.5 million in worth. So 3 grand in marketing, plus your leasing fees, plus tenant incentives, right? Your tenant incentives is 3 months free, right? So 3 months free. Now 3 months on 100K divided by 12, it works out at a bit over $8,000 a month, so $8,300 a month. Now by 3, that's about 25K in terms of value. Now remember, the value, it's a 25K value, whereas you're only paying the mortgage and potentially outgoings on this, or you could get the tenants to be paying outgoings, depending on how you structure it. But that to you might be, the real cost to you might be half that, maybe 12,500 or 15,000, but to the tenant that value is 25K because it's literally 3 months rent, right? So the whole cost to you of what it costs to put in a new tenant is 10K plus 3K plus 25K, right, to start with. So we're up to $38,000 as a total. So when we look at that, and look at that, it's 38K to put in a tenant to start with, right? That's the tenant coming in, having a rent free. Now, there's obviously changeover period from when the tenant leaves and the next tenant. And if you do it well and you're in a metro area, that's probably sometimes can be next to none. Sometimes can be 1 week, can be 2 weeks, and I've seen that in areas of Sunshine and Gold Coast and in Metro Sydney. But if you're in a little bit further out, or if an area that's harder to tenant, it could be 3 or 6 months. In general, you could be budgeting for vacancy. Now, my general rule is if you're a metro, I allow for 3 months of vacancy for you to get a new tenant, which allows time for you to have legals and advertising, put a new tenant in. So 3 months, that's maybe something that you need to allow for. So you need to allow for vacancy, right? You need to allow for vacancy. Now, vacancy, if it's 3 months, the cost to you is how much is it going to cost in outgoings and how much is it going to cost for you to support that property. So let's say that, 3 months, the mortgage might be 15K. Let's say the outgoings might be 5K. So that could be an extra 20K, right? So overall, the whole re-tenanting cost to you is the 38K, which is the 10K, 3K, and 25K, plus a 20K here of holding costs. So what that is $58,000 that is going to cost you, right? In real terms, it might cost you a little bit less. It might be something around 45, because remember, that's a value, not an actual cost, but it is still a significant chunk of money, right? And if you look at that, what does that mean to keep your current tenant? Now you start to value the cost of keeping your current tenant, and the cost of keeping your current tenant is really how much you can save off that $58,000. But bear in mind, the tenant has to be a good tenant that is paying rent, willing to pay outgoings, right? And there's a couple of ways to structure it. You can say your tenant is coming in and they're at an option period and you want to keep that tenant. You might be saying, well, is the tenant going to do some works on my property? If there is, am I going to give them some rent free? If they're not, I might just say to them, look, I might keep the rent stable this year and not give them any rent free, and hopefully they roll over a new 3 or 5 year lease. But if they really need an incentive, what I'm trying to save is anything off that $58,000. So if I gave them 3 months rent free for them to sign off for another 5 years or 3 years, what is that? That is really value to them, 25K, but to me it's 12,500. So I've actually saved myself $40,000, right? Now you might give your tenant might go and do some works, and that works might be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. They might want to relay out some problems. They might want to recarpet. They might want to put in disabled access. They might want to do something. Usually a tenant at the end of 5 or 10 years, especially 10 years, want to do some kind of refurbishment on the property. So what they're actually doing is actually adding the value to your property and refurbishing and making a new your property. So you should count that as a bonus, and if your tenant's willing to do that, you should be willing to give them more incentives and longer. So you can really give them up to 6 months and still save yourself money. Because 6 months, the value of 6 months is to the tenant $50,000 on a $100,000 rent, right? But to you, the actual cost could be 25K, especially if you structure it that the tenant pays the outgoings during that time and you're only giving them the rent free, which means it's $50,000 value for them that they're They're putting that towards a fit out and improving, and they're not actually pocketing that money. They're putting it into your premise, right? Which is actually good for you. Like, you don't have to do the work. They're managing work and everything. You're giving them 6 months rent free to get them to sign on a new 3 or 5 year lease, which increases the value of your property because now you have a longer lease. And that to you, the real cost is 25K out of your own pocket, but also increased. But whatever you put in there, the 25K, you gain on the value, so the capital growth on the back end, right? $100,000, if your property's worth 1.5, because you've got a tenant on a $100,000 lease on 3 or 5 years, is worth 1.5. If it's on no lease and it's vacant, the property could be worth 1.3, right? But if your tenant signed a new lease plus refurbishment, you could be taking it from 1.5 to potentially 1.7, and it's only costing you $25,000. So if you have a really good tenant, keep that tenant. Keep that tenant. The moral of the story, keep that tenant, save yourself the $58,000 or anything off that $58,000. If you have a bad tenant, and the fact that they're not going to pay rent on time, they're not signing a substantial lease, they're not paying the outgoings, or that they're just basically giving excuses not paying market rent, what that's costing you is the diminishing value on your property. So instead of being worth 1.5, it could be worth 1.2 or 1.1. Or even, or at best 1.3, because your tenant's not substantial and people not seeing it as a secure property, so they're not investing in it. So should you keep your tenant or change the tenant? Firstly, depends on your tenant quality and tenant type and whether they're paying rent or market rent. Secondly, whether they're willing to sign a lease and if there is a lease in place. Thirdly, are they improving the quality of your property or they're destroying the quality of your property? And if they're destroying it, you should get rid of them. If they're adding value to it, you should keep them. And fourth, finally, is the tenant in the long term going to give you more headache or less headache? And are they going to increase the capital value of your property or your asset in the long term? By getting them to stay, do you gain potentially 10, 15% more? Maybe not immediately, but after rent-free period is finished. Maybe, in 12 months' time, you can gain that 10 or 15%, or they're going to diminish the value by 10 to 15% because of the wrong tenant in the wrong property. So these are the 4 things you need to think about, right? But also, the most important thing is you don't have to give your rent freeze or incentives up front. You can give them 2 months now, 2 months in the second year, 2 months in the third year, and therefore for you, it's better for your cash flow. Or you can give them half rent all through the first 12 months, and that means you can still meet your mortgage repayment, just not getting any cash flow. Or you can stagger it and go, we're going to give you half rent for the first 4 months of every year, whichever way you want to do it. The main thing is you come to an equitable solution. Keeping a good tenant is worth its weight in gold because you make it up by the capital growth in the back end, the capital value appreciation in the back end. Keeping a bad tenant is destroying your cash flow, your value of your property, and creating headaches for you and destroying the rest of your portfolio mix. So, good or bad tenant, reach out to us, helen@unicorn.com.au. Let us help you build a cash flow rich portfolio. But let me help you through it. If you don't know whether a good or right tenant for your property, reach out to us. Happy to have a chat to you. See what I can do. See what I can help you with. The most important thing is you keep growing with commercial property. Reach that financial freedom so much faster. Click the link, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.